everyone, Aimer back with another Mission Impossible episode review. This time I am reviewing Season 7, Episode 6, which is called Cocaine. So we begin this one at a warehouse with Carl Reed and his second-in-command, Joe Conrad, admire a sculpture. The artist wonders why his work is put on such an ugly base, and Reed's supplier, La Roca, shows him that it's to be used for smuggling cocaine. Santoro says he'll have no part of it, Santoro, the artist that is, and leaves in a huff, only to be shot as soon as he opens a warehouse door. And Reed agrees to La Roca's deal to obtain the $10 million worth of drugs that will be shipped. Jim goes to a bookstore and uses some spy speak to get his instructions. The mission? The shipment is due to arrive within 72 hours and the IMF must locate and seize the drugs, even though none of the particulars have been established, such as where and when and all that. In the apartment scene, we learn that the IMF has made some very elaborate plans to impersonate other people, and are going to use the fact that Conrad frequents a gentleman's club called the Fun House. And Mimi, who is wearing what looks like an extremely expensive evening gown, is going to become a fun girl. Really subtle there. Reed sees a headline about new police officer Barney making a big drug bust and wants to know from his police contact why he didn't hear about it before it happened. Conrad realizes that the shipment went to the funhouse, and off we go there. Deliberately clumsy Mimi bumps into Conrad and then talks to Jim, who's impersonating funhouse proprietor Frank Fallon. They stage an argument for Conrad's benefit about Mimi being high, piquing Conrad's interest. He asks to meet after hours, but Mimi says Frank has rules about dating customers. She invites him to her place anyway in spite of that, in full view of Jim as Frank. Meanwhile, Willie gets into the offices of a credit company and switches up some data tapes. At Mimi's apartment, she and Joe get close, and he says he'd like to share in her happy stash, which is hidden in a secret compartment under the carpet. Officer Barney and his team bust in with a warrant, tearing the place apart and arresting Mimi, but not finding the drugs because I guess she was able to close it. Joe doesn't back up her alibi of being an old friend, and after Barney leaves, Joe opens the compartment, taking the IMF-planted drugs back to Reed and their chemist Stanley, who confirms that it's extremely pure stuff. Reed wonders why Fallon would be involved in the drug trade, as he's already rich, and asks a contact to pull his credit report, which of course comes out spotty thanks to Willie's work earlier. Reed tells Joe to talk to Barney about making a deal to work with them, but Barney isn't interested, figuring that Joe works for Fallon, who he already turned down. Mimi returns to her place to find Joe waiting for her. She says she doesn't know who Fallon's supplier is, and suggests they ask him directly. They head down to the funhouse, where Joe says he can distribute Fallon's stuff more effectively, but Jim turns him down and tells Mimi as Candy to get out of his life forever. Mimi angrily pulls out a gun and takes a very errant shot at Jim, and they struggle for the gun, and Mimi is shot. Joe seizes the opportunity to demand that Jim tell him about his operation, and they head to his facility, where chemist Willie is surprised to see them, but he shows them the setup, which outputs the pure cocaine the IMF had procured and shown us in the apartment scene. Joe calls Stanley to come over to check it out and not tell anyone about it, but Stanley does nervously inform Reed before coming over and verifies that the process is legit. Barney bursts in and is about to take the whole bunch of them downtown, but Joe stops him and asks him to think about what's going on. They found a way to manufacture perfect cocaine, which can make them all millions of dollars, as Reed is planning to meet with big distributors tomorrow night, and Joe is in a position to make a side deal. Joe pays Stanley off and tells him to forget about what he saw, and when Stanley leaves, Barney follows him and knocks him out with a ring to the neck. A gunshot is heard, and Barney claims he shot Stanley to prevent him from talking. The next day, Barney and Joe meet with the big distributors, and suddenly Jim and Willie bust in with bigger guns, holding them all at bay, while Mimi shows up and grabs the money, to Joe's absolute shock. Worse yet, the bags don't contain cocaine, it's sugar. The distributor threatens to shoot Barney and Joe, but Barney says that given some time, they can make it right, and the distributor agrees. The time comes for La Roca's pickup, and Reed gets his man Steve to follow Joe. Barney, of course, follows both of them. La Roca comes to Reed's office to exchange the pickup information for a locker key with the money, and Reed calls his pickup man, who is accosted by Conrad at gunpoint, who tells him to go to the Ames Art Gallery before Joe shoots him. He's able to tell Steve the information as well before he dies, who informs Reed, with Mimi listening in. The IMF heads out in pursuit of Joe, who drives like a madman, nearly runs over a crossing guard, for whom the IMF, of course, stops. Joe gets to the gallery to buy the sculpture. Reed gets there a few moments later, followed by the cops and the IMF showing their faces for a quick burn before heading away. Mission accomplished. I struggled a little bit in finding a grade for this episode. I wanted to give it a D-, but I've settled on a grade of F for this one. If I could invent a grade of F+, I think that's probably where I'd put it. But to be very, very honest, I really don't have anything that I can kind of latch onto and say that, oh yeah, there's something that was good about this episode. Other than the absolute basic fundamentals of it. The guest stars are fine. There's really nothing special about them at all. Even William Shatner doesn't really do much for me in this episode. He's a known quantity. You know what you're going to get out of him. And unlike an encore where, you know, he shone a little bit, past tense of shine, shone. He shone a little bit there because he was allowed to be, you know, what he's great at, his over-the-top self, playing an over-the-top character in a ridiculous situation, which is why that was entertaining and why that worked. He really can't do that here. And it's not that he's miscast. It's just that there's just nothing there. There's no meat on the bone, really, in this story for him to chew on, so to speak. The teamwork is okay, just like it is in all of these episodes, because there's really only 4 IMF members. And that's really all I can say that is even kind of okay. So I cannot find anything really good to latch onto this episode with and say that it deserves anything better than an F. Some of the problems I had with the episode. The plot is extremely cookie cutter. I was looking at it and I was saying, you know what? We've seen all of this before. There is no new ground covered here. In terms of, you know, the idea of having a guy who's in a position to be the second in command, kind of overreaching and trying to make a big score at some level. Well, you know, that already happened in the episode in season 3 called The Vault, and it's probably happened in other ones. The Vault is one that I was thinking of. You know, a guy turning on his boss the way that Joe Conrad does in this one is very much like Break, which we just saw a few episodes ago. At least here, the reasoning behind it is a little bit more sensible. You know, Joe Conrad doesn't go into business for himself just for no reason. He thinks he can make a really, really sizable score. And so that's what he does. The high point of the episode, and this is not something that I'm going to give it an increased grade for, Barbara Anderson's acting in Candy's apartment, where she seems all kind of strung out and everything. That was okay. You could call that a bright spot if you want, but that's about it. Joe Conrad, unfortunately, as the antagonist in this episode, is really a lame schmuck. He's way too predictable. And again, if we want to go and reference another episode, very much like Anthony Zerbe's character in The Amateur. Even when he gets to the point where he knows he's being played, right? He knows that Mimi is not dead. She shows up. He knows he's been basically completely played by Jim, Willie, and Mimi. Been played like a fiddle. He still continues. Maybe he feels like he's got no choice. But he doubles down due to his overconfidence and says, I can still pull this off. And, you know, just this eminent predictability of something that, frankly, could have been done fairly better, in my opinion. You know, we've got some competent antagonists and criminals saying, you know what, we're going to take some precautions. You know, we're going to use some secrecy. We don't even know when, you know, when and where, well, they know when, but where, you know, the merchandise is going to be dropped off. We're going to use intermediaries. We're going to use some coding and things like that. There was something here. There could have been, and it just isn't. There could have been, but it isn't. A few other things. The apartment scene. It lasted a full 2 minutes, and it has way too much exposition. Mimi saying stuff like, you know, I'll be Candy Collins, and, you know, this is what happened to this guy, and this is what this guy, all of that. I literally tuned out most of what was said during the apartment scene in this one. And that's never happened to me before. I'm just listening to this and I'm just like, this is hurting my head. There's just too much going on here. We should be able to figure this stuff out by watching the episode. Everybody's seen apartment scenes where basically, in the quality apartment scenes, the IMF alludes to things, right? They don't tell us we're going to do this and we're going to do that. They just go out and they do it, and we watch it unfold visually. They'll just say, hey, Roland or Barney, do you have this? This is all ready. I'm all set with this, Tim. That kind of stuff. And then, okay, off we go. Let's do this. And that doesn't happen here. And that is also really disappointing to me. That apartment scene kind of set the tone for the episode being really, really, really lackluster. Final nit I'm just going to pick with this episode, just again, you know, for the science part of it, I always go in that direction. About manufacturing cocaine, I looked it up because I was fairly certain about this, and not just from, you know, things I heard, you know, watching Breaking Bad and other shows like this. Some drugs, such as methamphetamine and such, and even some opioids, are viable to manufacture. Cocaine is not one of those drugs. This is obviously 50 years ago, but even today, you know, technically and scientifically, it is possible to do it. It's just simply not economically feasible for a whole lot of chemical reasons, which I won't get into. The process in which the coca plant, you know, from South America and other, mostly in South America and in Mexico, is, you know, produces the chemicals required for cocaine, is just so simple and so straightforward. It just makes a lot more sense to grow the plant than it does to actually go through the chemical process. Now, you know, they want to make a story out of this. I get it. But, you know, just from a real world standpoint, I had to throw that out there. I'm going to make this review really, really short. I think I've said everything that I have to say. No new ground covered here, unfortunately. And even despite having William Shatner, I can't give this episode any bigger than an F. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you guys, as always, for watching. Please like this review episode video for what it's worth. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and please leave your comments. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.